Hello and welcome to the OLM Working Group meeting. Today is Thursday, July 1st. On the agenda today, we have a topic on catalog template enhancement that's been opened in the enhancement repository from Jay Hunkins. John, do you want to go ahead and speak to this?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. Let's see if I can share my screen. And then it's not letting me do that. Apparently I didn't give it the permissions. I'm going to have to quit and come back. Sorry about that. 1 second.
Okay, yeah, no problem. In the meantime, I will drop the enhancement into the chat, and I encourage folks to take a look at it. It's a pretty interesting enhancement around moving between catalogs when upgrading the cluster.
All right, I'm back. Let me try that again. Try to share the screen. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So what I am going to talk about is the ability to switch out a catalog whenever the cluster is upgraded. So the scenario here is that you've got, you're on Kubernetes 119 and you've upgraded your cluster, and now it's to version 120. Same thing for OpenShift. If you upgraded from 4.5 to 4.6 or whatever. When that transition happens, the catalog image may need to be replaced to something that allows for compatible sets of operators that work with the new environment. So the motivation here is that we want to be able to have a way to be able to automatically switch out the catalog image. It's similar to the way that, well, it's somewhat, at least in theory, similar to how the cluster version operator works, but it's going to be something that we actually want to roll into the OLM operator instead. But the overall flow is that, the overall goal, what we're trying to accomplish here is to have the switching occur automatically and use a very simple mechanism to be able to do that. And the proposal is basically trying to use templating, URL templating, in order to accomplish this goal. So the idea is to create various kinds of templates that we can use, like kube major version, minor version, patch version. So there's a whole host of ones that we think probably should be recommended, or things that are come out of the box. You should definitely have, so like whenever they provide kube major version, you get whatever the major version is of that particular, whatever the cluster is running at that given moment. And so this templating is just a simple format where it just starts with curly braces, and then inside there is the template name, no spaces. So you just kind of make some simple buying assumptions about how you'd actually want to format it. And then, so there's ones that are for OLM specific kinds of things that we definitely have to require. And there are other things that we could have for other kinds of downstream templating. So in this case, it would be things like, OTP major version, or maybe the update channel. So there's values that may require things that require different implementations that that aren't necessarily things that you can just do out of the box. Like these ones, you can guarantee that they're always going to be available. These ones, not so much. So we have to decide, if we want to go down the path of actually including these. As a part of this, there was Daniel Messer actually suggested maybe changing this to distro, but that opens up some other potential problems of now you've got to support like every single kube, the ones that popped to mind were like, IBM Kubernetes Service and Pivotal and whatever. There's a whole host of different ones. And each one has its own potential problems of how do I find out what the version is for those things. So this might not be I'm suggesting this one is maybe either something that's implemented downstream or something that we do for a 2.0 kind of thing, and concentrate probably on these ones for sure. And just at least for just getting started. So the simple example here is probably help just give some concrete example. So the image value in this case is that they use the cube version here, and they intersperse things over throughout here, so you have multiple templates that are being used in the same value in the same image. So like here's major version is used in a couple different spots, and this one happens the minor version. Well, we should be able to do templating across that whole string no matter what. So right now we know where we would get all of these values, at least the ones that I've actually highlighted here for where you can get the cube version, OLM version, and the OCP version. I've actually kind of drawn those out exactly where you actually pull that information from. Downstream OLM, we know that there's actually a the cluster versions config object. You can actually go pull that version information from. So we have ways to be able to go, at least in the ways that I've defined here in the proposal. We know how to get that information. Now, when it comes time to you try to capture that information, and let's say that there's some sort of error occurs as a part of this process, you're going to have to do something sensible with that. And so you're going to have to put like a cannot construct image reference variable and then spit out whatever the name is that you couldn't actually resolve. So that way, at least the user has some idea of like what is it that it's complaining about. And also, I think the status section should not only include the successful path, but also the unhappy path. So basically, it should actually dump out, here's what I think I've computed the value to be. This is the value that I've resolved, because some pieces may be resolvable and some pieces may not. And being able to see a visual representation of that would be useful. But the important part is to making sure that at least that minimally there's got to be an error message that is associated if you can't actually resolve the information. And also, if you can't resolve it, that basically means, you kind of have to stop reconciling at that point. There's not much you can do beyond that because there's no image for you to pull from. So, okay. So I guess that's and the rest of this is all just, kind of basic information about what I think, how we, what the acceptance criteria is and that sort of thing. So I don't know how deeply you want to go into this, but or the user stories and whatnot. But basically, that's the high level of it. Anyone have any thoughts or questions or?
So I have a question about sort of the parameterization of the template. So like each one of these different values, it seems like every time we want to extend sort of how you can add it as written, you'll need to add, every time we want to extend what you can sort of reference as a value in your template, we'll need to sort of codify that in OLM first class. So it doesn't seem like there's an extension mechanism that you can tell, oh, when you see this value, or when you see this, sorry, I'm having trouble with words today.
Yeah, couldn't that be like a phase 2 kind of thing, where for some reason maybe you decide some naming convention that describes a plugin like the beginning. So the fact that he's got underscores in here, you could say dots are reserved, and then maybe use dots as a precursor to describe the plugin that it would invoke or something.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds reasonable. I don't mean to be the guy, but like I sort of kind of question the need to bring more overhead onto OLM for templating things out when it seems like whatever is performing the upgrade might be a better place to sort of have some way of updating the catalog to what the cluster has updated to, right?
But how do they know what that is?
Because they're the ones initiating the update.
But that's OpenShift. OpenShift is initiating the update, right? And this is a third-party catalog.
Mm-hmm.
So the contract is really these template variables. Otherwise, you'd have to have like annotations with every possible, for example, you could have annotations with every possible catalog source and then do some kind of dynamic replacement, because you'd have to have knowledge of all of that.
All right, I see where you're coming from. I was sort of thinking about the pure cube world, right? The upstream world where, you know, you may have something that's not the cluster version operator applying changes to the cluster with an upgrade, but that's a fair point. I mean, it would, in this situation, it may make sense for, you know, CVO to have some way of saying, run this arbitrary, you know, code upon upgrade.
I mean, the alternative we thought of is introduce yet another catalog source, right? A catalog source of catalog sources, which is pretty heavy, or, you know, extending the catalog source definition, right? Right, to be able to have a full manifest of all the possible catalog source images that might resolve depending on some kind of variables. But that all seems really, I guess, over-engineered, over-architected, I guess, for what we would need to do here for something that's relatively a simple problem.
Well, I mean, those things can be implemented today without taking on additional burden on OLM's side in terms of like the API surface. And this is actually like increasing the API service.
Okay.
Again,
so
I think this is a
yeah,
really well-written enhancement, and I think this is on its own makes a lot of sense. But I'm just hesitant to add more surface to OLM, if that makes sense.
So this feature was actually suggested by Daniel, and he really wanted to do this upstream. So I think he was shooting towards having this as an API enhancement to OLM, specifically I think the catalog operator.
Okay. I still have the same would have the same feelings in that scenario.
Yeah, and so this is one of the things that Daniel had actually brought up about the, you know, the idea of having things for trying to deal with things for downstream. You know, like, you know, instead of doing OCP, this is where he made that suggestion of saying, well, maybe instead of OCP, maybe it's just something more, you know, generic like distro. But then distro does have, you know, when I tried to reply with that was just distro does imply that you have to kind of know what all the distributions are that you really want to support for with this feature. And then all of those have their own different, you know, different versioning mechanisms for being able to, you know, how do I find that information, or is it even available? I mean, it should be, but you know, who knows where it lives, right? So that's, well, and so I guess the point here is that, you know, if we start with OCP, at least we know where that one comes from. We know it's we have a well-known thing, target that we can actually apply for. We can actually implement that at least in the first go. And then, you know, maybe in a second release or whatever, we can come back and actually add some of the other ones. I mean, there's approaches to here, I think, where we could actually do at least the, you know, the main ones that I was talking about which is basically these required templates. These are things I think we can do pretty easily, and have it work regardless of whatever platform you happen to be running on.
Yes, this is starting to look very similar to me to the OpenShift sort of template API, but much more narrow scope. And I think the idea that Evan brought up before of features and feature bindings is applied to general resources could do something very similar as well. So long as you like provide something on the cluster that knows to keep filling that template out with like the new values that you care about from the upgraded cluster. All of which would not change the existing catalog source API. But go ahead, Evan, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting at, you know, we don't want to introduce a bunch of extra support burden for something, but I think it is worth calling out that, you know, we have this general guideline for how you should probably manage catalogs. Like we've talked about this on this call before, that you should probably have one, at least at the current rate of change in Kubernetes, you probably want one per kube version right now, because it's harder to have guarantees around what stuff works across larger sets of versions. And then to kind of be on your own to set that up the whole time. I do kind of buy that this is a gap. I personally think that like the ideal solution is the one that has been sort of punted on, which I actually think using declarative config to do catalog of catalogs makes a lot of sense and fits in with the general direction we've been talking about for OLM, where we don't, you know, what is a catalog we pull down? It's just another artifact we pull down and unpack, right? No different from operator bundles. And how do we pick them? Well, it's no different from how we pick operators to install. We use the resolver to figure out what properties match the requirements. So I think I agree that would be over engineering to sort of do that all from scratch, but the fact that it just reuses all the other machinery that we already have makes that pretty attractive to me. I don't know that we have to start there. Like this seems like a pretty reasonable stopgap. This probably covers 90 to 100% of the use cases we have right now. And then if we have, if we want to play with the defining catalog of catalogs, you know, have a blob type that's an OLM index instead of an OLM bundle. I think that's kind of a reasonable next step, and hopefully these templates buy us the time to do that correctly. I don't know, that's kind of what I see this as being. I don't know if that's jiving with everyone else.
I think I definitely agree with that, Evan. I think something that knows about the context of the catalog that you're running in is a reasonable, like, I think, thing for the project to try to solve. And I think that a simple solution like this probably is something that we might want to try to implement. I have some questions specifically about the value that we're bringing right now. So like, I guess the thing I'm thinking is, if all we're trying, like, if the goal of this project is so that OpenShift can do an OpenShift thing, because OpenShift has this specific way of doing upgrades, is there something we can do just downstream that doesn't add burden to the cluster in the upstream case, right? Like, in order to do something like this, we're going to have to add a bunch of stuff to the catalog operator that knows how to parse the fields, unpack them, read an API, probably keep cache of that API and watch for changes to it, and then you know, potentially update the catalog based on the value of that thing. In anywhere except for OpenShift right now, that's going to just be a no op unless somebody has another specific reason for using this. So
Well, hold on. So before you get there, I mean, the real reason this is here is for the upcoming Kubernetes version that's going to have breaking APIs, right? OpenShift 4.9, Kube, whatever it is, 22, 1.22.
Mhm.
So this does affect Kubernetes upstream, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons we're proposing this for OLM, to solve that problem.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I guess the thing I'm wondering is anybody publishing Cube specific, upstream Cube specific catalogs right now?
Well, I think we're considering having to do that, right? I mean, this is part of this is our preparation for the day when we will need to do something to address multiple catalogs, where we will need to maintain multiple different versions of catalogs that are compatible with some particular version or another. I mean, so that is the thinking here, for at least from our perspective. And ideally, what we were hoping to be able to do was to go with this particular approach. And like you say, it handles probably 80–90% or whatever of the use cases. If we can get this in now, I mean, if we can get this into 4.9, I mean, I think this is doable to be able to get this into 4.9. But I guess it's just a matter of, I think it's like July 23rd is when this is supposed to be done. But if we make it more complicated than what I'm currently proposing, it gets a little difficult to actually accomplish that. So I don't know. Yeah.
I think one other thing is around digest-based images versus tag-based images. And I know we've introduced sort of polling as a way to use your tags and move around the content in the tags, but we I think having digest-based images where definitively what they are, and then you have somewhere else, like in your build system or some other place, something that can do this type of logic, that is also another approach that I think is more in sync with the overall trend. So not saying that we shouldn't do this, but that's something that jumped out at me, is that we kind of are moving more and more towards these dynamic tag-based catalogs and away from digest-based catalogs.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the other. I think that sort of hits on one of the other things I was thinking about here, which is I think it is totally reasonable for there to be an API that tracks on a release version or something along those lines. I guess the delineation between it existing just as part of the core API itself, as opposed to some templating API on top of that, it feels like there's, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this, but it feels like you probably want to explicitly opt into that, rather than I happen to name my catalog a specific way and something happened as a result. Like we have, like this is something I've been thinking about a bunch, which is like downstream we have this API, which is like the thing that pulls stuff along for OpenShift releases, that kind of, like, if you squint, sort of looks like a very similar problem. The only difference is that we're able to sort of like codify that set of content as part of the payload for the OpenShift installation. I'm just wondering if that's actually I think this is reasonable. I'm wondering if that API, the Operator Hub API, is actually the place where we might want to do this sort of thing, or if we want to try to have some API that defines some consistent defaults that are always applied to the cluster that you can't just delete, aside from going to that separate API. Yeah, exactly, Evan. Like it's something that like is catalog source plus that knows how to do updates. that kind of feels like it would be maybe the better place for this. I think that's like, if we're trying to do this in 3 weeks, that's probably more overhead than I think we're willing to take on immediately. I'm more imagining like if we're do a V2 version of this, what would it look like?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the thing was that we were looking at actually dedicating resources to working on this particular piece. So I know that you know, I don't think there would the ask here was for anyone on the Red Hat side to necessarily, or you know, on the OLM team in general to do this. I think that we're looking at. I just started working this afternoon on trying to actually work through the process of actually, if I have a catalog source, how do I go through the process of actually doing the templating and all of that kind of stuff. So I've actually got some code here that does do this work of, you know, right now I'm skipping over the whole, where do I get the values from and whatever. But the point being is that, you know, as long as you have the values that you want, it will do the templating. So, I mean, you know, I guess from an engineering perspective, we're looking at trying to contribute this to the upstream community.
Yeah,
So just to make that clear.
So I think, I don't think the issue is like getting people to work on it. And we're very happy that you guys are like contributing and like writing code for the project. I think the question comes up in my mind is, we'll have an alternative way to do this. You can essentially like create a catalog with with everything in it, and then you'd have runtime properties that discriminate between what can be resolved to the cluster at runtime. And you will also in the future, if we introduce this, have an alternate route of being able to template out a specific field with a subset of parameters to basically discriminate the catalog that's pulled separately. So now we're presenting users with 2 different distinct paths for doing this first class in OLM's APIs, whereas like you could implement something like this completely outside of OLM with a generic templating tool today, or even have a small controller that just updates the catalog source that you care about every time as you upgrade, and knows how to gather those fields itself and knows how to change the stuff without that. And then, you know, users still have one way of like resolving things and writing the catalog source ref going forward. So that broadening of the API service, I think, is the crux of my concern here.
Okay. I guess the question here then is, you know, what happens when we do need to be able to do a switch out of a catalog? I mean, are we just basically saying for now, it's just going to be, you just have to do this manually? I mean, if we don't implement this now, is what I'm afraid of is that we're going to be caught with, you know, because our inception process currently has you know, we have a Helm chart that actually goes and installs a catalog source. So that way our catalog can actually be provided to the end users. Our concern is like trying to figure out how to deal with the, you know, the inevitable upgrade that's going to happen. And, you know, as a part of that, does that mean that, you know, we're basically making this into a manual process at this point?
Could you not write a very small controller that just updates a catalog source and knows about all the things that you care about and gets installed by OLM?
This is sort of like that to me, that's sort of what I'm wondering is, can we make this more or less exactly what we're describing and more or less exactly the form we're describing? Can we make it a separate controller from the actual catalog source controller? That I think that's kind of where I'm thinking out loud.
So doing something like this, but yet not something that's not built into OLM.
This is exactly what I brought up 2 months ago, and then I think I don't know who talked about it, but then they said this really makes sense to put as part of the catalog. So we're kind of flipping back.
Yeah, I think
Otherwise, every catalog provider will have to do their own, right? When it seems like it's a common feature that would be necessary.
Unless we had an annotation-based approach that says if they annotate the catalog sources in a certain way, then our fancy operator just knows how to convert those catalog or those annotations to image references based on some environment settings. So it ends up becoming a side controller rather than an integrated controller.
Yeah, I think also one way of looking at it is like if this is entirely in the context of upgrading catalogs, like we have this polling feature, right? And one of the things we threw around was not just talking to an external registry, but talking to like an external API of some kind when you want to update your catalog that can know what the next image should be. I think that might also be something to think about if this sounds a lot like more intelligent updating, more intelligent catalog updating, polling. That's something else that is another possibility. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the path that I think we thought about was definitely runtime properties for how a single catalog could contain multiple different, types of things for different basically resolving dependencies based on like arbitrary runtime constraints for a cluster, and then like having a generic way to sort of tell OLM what to look for on the cluster and what to associate with which value. And so like you could have a catalog that has a bunch of stuff in it, and then you can filter that down to only the stuff for your particular architecture. That's how we envision people not having to like re-implement something like this every time. But the alternatives that we mentioned previously in the call were like generic templating thing that like just knocks out key resources and keeps them up to date, or a controller that knows specifically about what you care about, that you're implementing. And those that first option doesn't tie you to release dates in OCP, right? It lets you work on your own time schedule within your company rather than like relying on getting something in upstream in OLM. As well. So like you have options here, even if this doesn't go in, is I guess what I'm saying.
I mean, I guess, if we don't put this into OLM, then yeah, I mean, I think, you're pushing off if I understand your question, or what you're saying is that, you're basically pushing off the logic of how to decide when to upgrade to individual catalog implementers, who are using the catalogs and need to be able to switch it out, whatever. And so you're making those individual teams figure out how to do this on their own.
Well, so I know there's a feature coming out also that you're working on to be able to interrogate the operators to see if they're going to be compatible with the next version. I think I can't remember what they called it. It's like operator protection or something like that. Mm-hmm. So if we provided our own proprietary way of detecting the current version of OpenShift updated, and so we're going to flip the catalog after the fact, there's no way for you to tie into that unless you tie into all the proprietary mechanisms to do that. So one of the advantages of having this as part of the spec is that feature could leverage this to figure out, I should look when I'm checking the next version, I need to pull down the catalog sources that are compatible with that next version, examine all the packages, channels, pinned versions, all that stuff to see if they're going to be compatible from that perspective, because they might be the same version numbers, but the contents of the CSVs might be different. Know what I mean?
Yes. I need to sit with this particular enhancement a bit more, but I mean, just my opinion is not the opinion of everybody else here or the opinion of what gets in or doesn't get in. So I'm just sort of, I've been saying my own personal thoughts and ideas about the project. So
I'm just saying, I think we're gonna, so in 4.9, we're gonna be broken for sure. So we are gonna be providing multiple catalogs. That's almost a certainty, because not all of our products are gonna be able to get off of the APIs. And so we're gonna have to solve that somehow. And having ability to switch catalogs is gonna be really important for us. It won't fix the breaking problem, right? After they've done it, they're gonna have to write some kind of tool. Maybe we provide them a tool, right, to check to see, to do this all of ourselves, all proprietary. It'd be really nice if we could have it all, you know, compatible with everybody.
So, so I think I want to take a small step back. I think that there's some very reasonable points being brought up here, and I don't think that we are intending to not take those into account. I think that this is I want to say, like, I think this is a reasonable project to include as part of OLM. I think it's something that makes sense. I think we just want to make sure that the way it is eventually implemented makes sense in the context of the other existing APIs and doesn't provide, or it doesn't cause a lot of technical debt going forward. So I think, like, probably what we maybe want to talk about a little bit is, can we break up the sort of like maybe rough edges around what's here and see if there are paths forward where we can kind of smooth over those edges, even if the smoothing over looks like something slightly more long-term. And the other thing is, I think that maybe we should sort of make sure that whatever it is that we're eventually putting in the project is something that's usable by everybody and not just certain subsets of people for their specific use case. I think that's really the only thing I see here that could be potentially problematic. But otherwise, I mean, I think conceptually it's a pretty reasonable thing to want to include. Is that fair? I'm just trying to maybe level set a little bit about, I think this conversation, we're kind of jumping around quite a bit, so.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't sure whether there was a vote going on behind the scenes here and we're getting trumped, or if there's still, if we still.
No, I don't think so. Like, I think like Chris, like, I think that it's just kind of like everybody who happens to be involved in the project is here sort of expressing their own thoughts.
Yeah,
I don't think we should take any one person is saying as like, this is how this is what's being said is true or not. So I think, you know, I don't know. I don't know that we have, like, I mean, the project is young. I don't know that we historically have had like a method of deciding whether we want to do something or not do something. Maybe it makes sense for us to sort of bootstrap that process a little bit here, given that there's some contention. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that. I don't know if we're going to maybe necessarily solve that problem in the next 19 minutes, but I think it's probably a reasonable thing to start thinking about and noodling on. In the more immediate term, though, I guess what I'm wondering is, like, can we come up with a set of like sort of short-term goals here, or at least next steps, so that we can get to a point where A, we're building something into the project itself that seems reasonable, and B, that we have maybe just a path forward. So I guess, like, for me, if I was to call out some specific things I would like to see maybe updated in this current proposal, the first thing is, I think that so I want to make the statement that I think the project has the problem and limitation, I think, of it sort of looking a lot like it spawned out of OpenShift. There's a lot of very OpenShift specific bits that are going in. If we build something that solves an OpenShift specific problem, I think that's the wrong look for the project. And so anything we can do to sort of remove some of that or paper over it in some way to make it more digestible for a larger community audience would, I think, be really helpful.
So
And
you
if
want us just to abstract all of the OpenShift terms and put in distro or whatever, some arbitrary thing, just to call out the fact that on how it would be extended, hence codifying those variables.
yeah, I think that would be good. I think that's going to be that's an important first step. I'm also even more trivially wondering if we even need to do the distribution bit as opposed to literally just doing this entirely based on cube version. Because there's a one-to-one relationship right now in OpenShift with a specific cube minor release, and probably the only thing that catalogs care about is up to the level of the minor release anyway. So that's one thought I just sort of am throwing off the top of my head. And the only other thing is sort of this question of where the code itself lives, whether it's inside the catalog reconciler itself, or maybe a separate controller that pre-processes or post-processes or watches the catalogs in some way and applies them. I don't know that it makes sense to ship that as a separate operator, right? Like right now, the catalog operator has like 4 or 5 controllers in it. And so maybe trivially to start, just to get this bootstrapped and have something available, create a new controller in the catalog operator. And then in the future, if we have a way of splitting that off into its own separate thing that is separately installable, or maybe at some point, like this is the reason I'm saying this is because I think we've been throwing around some ideas around what that operator hub API looks like. If it would potentially be valuable upstream, could we pull something up that does something like that? It feels like there's a lot of crossover there. I don't know that I have a specific implementation of what that would look like in mind, but eventually I'm imagining that because the goals of those different projects seem close enough that we might want to try to coalesce down to some specific implementation that solves both. But I don't know. I'm not saying I don't know that that needs to be solved right away. I think we can continue to kind of noodle on that.
So if you actually do a separate controller, does that imply then instead that that you're actively updating the catalog source with new information based on, so you've interrogated it, it says, code version changed from 19 to 20. And so therefore I need to go update the catalog source image reference directly from that controller.
Yeah,
and then all the rest of the logic of the existing controller continues to just work off of, as it is today. And so you haven't really changed anything there. You're just talking about how to get it to effectively munge the catalog source if it needs to be changed.
Yeah. I think the trivial implementation of that might look something like you have you basically poll or watch for changes to the cube version on cluster, and if it changes, do a list for all of the catalog sources on the cluster. For the ones that fall into the specific delimiters, if you need to update those, you can just write to the catalog sources at that point.
So then, as far as for the OLM version one, is that something that is the OLM version consistent from upstream and downstream?
This is another thing that I'd be very careful of. The downstream OLM version, like if you're trying to OLM version from the binary, you're not going to get the right answer, because that version is that version plus a bunch of other patch sets on top of it that may make that thing look like something else. So if we want to solve that problem for OpenShift, we would probably need to make some changes to the way that OLM writes its version downstream.
Because the way that it works, just the reason why I'm asking is because I put it into the spec to say that the OLM version can be contained, obtained from the package version, which has the OLM version variable. And I think that the build infrastructure pipes that in, it from the file that's actually included as there's a file called OLM_version where that version comes from. So I just didn't know if the downstream side of it actually had the same, major minor patch kind of thing. And so therefore you could still rely on the fact that there's a version available and it comes from this variable.
Yeah, and I think that is not going to be accurate. The downstream, like it pulls that stuff down. It does not have like I said, it does not have a one-to-one relationship between whatever that version field says at all.
Okay, so effectively you're saying that OLM, this idea of doing OLM version probably doesn't work even for downstream.
Yeah, I think so. I think that probably the only thing that's going to work is the cube version stuff.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question that I may have missed? So Kevin, you're suggesting let's just add a new controller that watches Cube API version and anything that would change the value of these templated values. And then based on change to those, then update the catalog source spec. I guess my question is, are we adding a new field to the spec called like image template? Because otherwise we're going to overwrite that template. We're going to overwrite that image value and then the template will be gone.
Yeah, it just occurred to me as well. I don't think the template can be in the image. I think it has to be someplace else. So the controller can inject it there. Otherwise you're going to have race conditions and things get erased and all that stuff. Yeah, I think annotation is probably the right place to put it. Otherwise we'd have to like update the CRD spec and all that stuff was probably overkill.
That's probably a good starting point, but that's why that's totally fair. I think annotation is probably a good place to start. I do think eventually we have some controller with an explicit API specifically for this templating. And that thing probably looks a lot like the operator hub API that lives downstream right now with its own spec.
So you're thinking about a generic templating API.
I'm actually saying more than just templating. I think that thing also defines stuff that is just like you don't even, it could template, but it could also just take a flat value as well. And that the thing that defines those API, so like right downstream, the way that this works is it is not a CVO object that we just apply to the CVO and it's part of the payload. There's an explicit API called operator hub that defines a set of catalog sources that we dump into it. And it has some other features too, right? Like one of the things you can do is like, because everything in the CVO automatically gets force applied. So you can forcefully say, actually, no, this catalog source should exist. Even if you delete the catalog source, it's going to come back. It has some like other controls in it. So you can do stuff like disable some of those defaults. It sort of feels like we could extend that to add some templating. And then we more or less have exactly what you're looking for. I think that probably we can't do that right away because that thing is downstream only. We'd have to like create an upstream version of it and make that part of the OLM control plane somehow.
Yeah, you talk about like pilfering that code and just refactoring it into something a little smaller and self-contained.
Yeah, more or less. I think that's exactly what I'm suggesting. But like I said, I don't think we need to do that to start. I think to start, we can just sort of have like a generic generic controller that just looks at the annotations of CSVs for some well-defined templating thing. That should make this small enough that you can probably get it written in the next couple of weeks. And then we can kind of sort of flesh that out some more if when we have more time.
Is this an annotation? So say we add support for this annotation, and then we later go and do what you're suggesting, Kevin. Are we eventually removing support for this annotation and saying, go use this other thing? Or do we have now a problem where we have to somehow reconcile between the annotation and this other API?
That's a fair question. I mean, we could call it a beta feature. I don't know. Yeah, the rules with OpenShift are kind of strict that make it hard for you to get rid of stuff like this.
All right, so I'm trying to understand. So I think what you're suggesting is we take a peek at how the Operator Hub API works, which it'd be helpful if you guys give us maybe a link to where some source is or some design doc there. And then we change this a little bit. So we still have a separate controller doing this work, but what it's doing is translating probably two annotations, or at least an annotation that has a grammar that describes what your image template should look like, and then the target field within the current manifest that you want to put it in. Basically, the source, template it, you have the source template, you resolve it, and you slam it into some other variable, overriding some data. So that's the generic tool, the generic controller that we end up building, which ends up becoming specific to catalog sources at the moment, but in theory could be migrated towards something a little bit more generic globally in the future. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's more or less what I'm saying. Like to me, I view this as this is a catalog config API that lives separately. It's still part of the operator framework. It might even be part of the default install that you get for OpenShift or not OpenShift, for upstream OLM if you don't like turn off that knob or whatever. But that's a lot of work to ask you guys to just go and do. So in the meantime, if you want to build something that just still lives as part of the catalog operator, I think that's reasonable.
All right, so John, you kind of caught up with what I was just said there. So I think all it is you move your template to an annotation, right? And so the image just gets set to be some default value, right? So maybe latest or something like that that the customer could put in. And then your annotation would have the template, and it would also have maybe a marker that says, oh, I want this in .spec.image.
So some place, like a dotted notation for where it is within the document that you want to actually replace the value.
Yep. So we just should take a little peek at what Operator Hub has, because they have something similar, it sounds like, but I think it's part of their official API, not an annotation-based thing.
And so, and like you said, the current thing is to scope it to just catalog sources as the target for this thing. But in the future, you could open that up to other things. But we're for a first pass, just stick to catalog source as a thing.
Right. So if your annotation, make your annotation scoped to operator or CoreOS.io or whatever, operator CoreOS.io domain, right? And then the controller then would only watch catalog source resources, look for those specific annotations, and that controller would live as part of the the catalog operator. Is that right?
Okay. Is that so? So just so that's the thing that I'm not really aware of. Can you actually can you watch for resources that are without saying what kind they are and look for a particular annotation? Just out of curiosity, is that something that's possible or no?
So I don't think you would even need to watch for the resources, is kind of what I was saying. what you would want to do is you'd want to write something that watches for changes to the thing that you're actually triggering on. And the thing that we are actually triggering on is the Kubernetes version change, right? Like you don't actually like.
Well, no, because you need to trigger on the creation of the catalog source, right? Because it's going to have a generic image in there, and you're going to want to target the initial version also, not just on upgrades.
And if
Yes, but you can do that, right? You can do that on startup.
Startup of what?
The controller?
The controller is already running. So you started the controller, and now someone creates a catalog source after the fact. You have to modify the catalog source, without having to create yet another webhook. You're going to have to modify the image reference.
Yeah, that's true.
This is why I'm more partial to just going and writing a template controller or using an existing template controller and then just having something that uses that template-esque CR to stamp out and keep the catalog up to date. And it's the thing that knows about the fields you care about. So you can write the template separately from the catalog source. And you don't have this problem with like having to try to mutate it after the fact or having a temporarily invalid catalog source.
You talk about a catalog source factory.
Precisely, but I mean, like, it should be very little work to go to have that just accept. There's even a type for it for embedding other types of resources or like taking a YAML, inline YAML manifest that is like a Go template or something,
But where would that live, though? Would you have to put that in another custom resource, a config map, an annotation of some other object? Where do you hang that off of?
That thing itself would be its own CR. So you'd have a CRD, and like this could be something that's like included with. We could even include it in OpenShift by default. I know OpenShift already has a template. The controller itself that handles updating. So you can think of this as two distinct controllers, one being the thing that handles the template stamping and keeping what you say in the template up to date is there. And I know there's already one. I think there's one that's very close for OpenShift already. But then the other one would be the one that knows how to like figure out which arguments you want to inject into that template, that specific template. And that thing would be what you either apply to your cluster directly and it long lives on your cluster throughout all the upgrades, or OLM, it's like an OLM operator and it gets installed. And it, has a dependency on that template API, so like.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So we're out of time, unfortunately. Oh. So are you saying OpenShift already has this full-blown thing that we would lift and shift over there, or we'd have to base something off of some OpenShift code?
So this wouldn't be upstream. This would be downstream only. I believe the template API isn't upstreamed, and I think it has like 90%, but that's only on like the templating, like creating a template and applying the resources from the template to the cluster, not changing the arguments fed into the parameters.
Are you talking about the old OpenShift template API?
Yeah, that was what I was talking about. But if we want to do something upstream, we could, and I would feel comfortable maybe personally including that by default with OLM, since I think that's something that'll be useful to everybody later on as well. But it could also be an OLM operator that just gets installed. And so like what you have is an initial installation of this thing that depends on your custom controller that depends on the template API that puts those arguments in, and then OLM installs it, and then that just stays up to date. Does that make sense?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna have to replay what you said on the recording.
It might be, I know we're already over time. It might be useful for us, for those who are interested, to maybe have a follow-up call either tomorrow or sometime early next week,
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to
where we
suggest
have
that.
some, maybe some time to bake these ideas in our heads. And
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is a time-sensitive thing. So if we wait 2 weeks, that's gonna be way too late. So if we could get.
yeah,
some-
that's why I'm kind of suggesting, can we talk again like tomorrow, maybe?
I can't. My vacation starts tomorrow, but I don't know,
Okay.
John, are you around?
Yeah, I mean, I'm around tomorrow. I mean, it'd be
Okay.
good for you to actually be there too, I think, but yeah, certainly, we can start with, without you. But, yeah,
Okay, well, why don't we maybe spawn a thread in Slack, and then we can try to see where we can go from there. If not tomorrow, then I think probably most of us are off on the US holiday on Monday, but should be around Tuesday.
yeah, and I'm actually out through, well, I'll be back, the Thursday after that, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at the very least, we can start an async conversation and kind of go from there. I think I need to bake this in my brain at least overnight before I have ideas that aren't bad.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, cool. So yeah, let's follow up. Let's follow up. I know you said it's time sensitive, so let's try to stay on top of this ahead of the 122 bump. All right, with that, I think we're over. So let's call the meeting for today. Thank you everyone for joining the working group meeting. I think it was really productive. And have a good holiday, and we'll see everyone at the issue triage meeting next weekend. Thank you.